Hello and welcome to EURACTIV Beyond the Byline Podcast. I am Mirko Paradiso, and for this week, and only for this week, I'll be covering my colleague Evie Corey, who is out of office at the moment. In this episode, we will be checking the latest news related to the energetic crisis and how this is affecting the life of the Europeans, and we will also try to discuss possible immediate and long-term solutions to this situation. Also, today we will talk about the conference on the future of Europe 6 months after its official start, and we'll check how is it going, where it is going, and what we should learn from these appointments of discussions among the institutions and the citizens. The energetic crisis has recently brought the prices of energy to soar, and this has created numerous concerns in Europe. Here I am today with Frédéric Simon, our energy and environment reporter at EURACTIV. Thanks, Frédéric, to be joining us today. The first question, of course, is how the crisis is affecting the life of the Europeans, especially those of the low and middle income classes.
Well, everyone is affected, obviously, by the rise in energy prices, but people are affected differently, of course, depending on their incomes. Now, you have to put that in perspective with the numbers related to energy poverty around the European Union. And so according to the Commission, there were around 31 million people across the EU who were considered to be living in energy poverty, meaning they were unable to keep their houses warm in winter or had to choose between heating or putting food on the table. And that proportion, of course, could now be going higher because of the energy crunch and the COVID-19 crisis, which is pushing more households closer to poverty. And according to some estimates, that could be around 80 million people who could be pushed towards energy poverty because of this energy crisis. Now, these numbers may look huge, but in fact, they're not totally unrealistic if you look at the scale of the population across the EU. We're talking about a population of around 450 million people. And already before the COVID crisis, some 110 million people in Europe were already considered to be at risk of poverty or social inclusions. So with energy prices now going up by a factor of 2 or 4 in some EU countries, it actually seems quite plausible, in fact, that millions more will fall into energy poverty this winter because of the energy crunch.
Okay, thanks, Frédéric. But what about the measures that have been taken so far to tackle this crisis? Have they been effective in helping the Europeans?
So yes, you can say, of course, that the measures that have been taken so far are indeed effective. What governments have been doing since a number of weeks already is basically to cut taxes on energy and to supply vulnerable customers with special support schemes. For example, in France, the government has started distributing energy vouchers to the poorest households. This is a scheme that was already in place, and the French government decided to add 100 euros in addition to what these households were already entitled to. So this is something that is already being rolled out in countries like France, and similar schemes have been put in place in countries like Greece, for example. So the strategy put forward by these governments is working. And is helping households deal with the situation, at least now, in the short term. Now, obviously, this is not something that you can do for the long term because the money doesn't grow on trees, and so the government cannot just continue subsidizing households like this. And this is something that will eventually also be felt in the treasury of these member states, and so this is not a sustainable policy.
Okay, what's the long-term strategy of the EU? What do they want to do to prevent any similar crisis in the future?
In the long run, the effects of the EU strategy will take a lot longer to be felt. So the longer-term strategy of the European Union is to decrease its reliance on imported gas and fossil fuels generally, and accelerate the deployment of homegrown renewable sources of energy, as well as increasing energy efficiency, for example, through programs like the renovation wave, which is supposed to decrease the energy consumption of households. So all of that, of course, is going to make a difference, but the effect is not going to be felt in the short term. In fact, these programs take years, even sometimes decades, to materialize, and so it's not the kind of thing that you can expect can bring immediate results for this winter. At least for sure, consumers won't see the difference. Now, in 10 years from now, probably they will see a difference, but certainly not in the short term.
Okay, let's talk about nuclear energy and gas. There have been a lot of discussions going on this source of energy that could be implemented as transitional sources in the EU green finance taxonomy. Could this make any difference in the short term?
Well, that has no influence at the moment, and it won't have an influence in the coming 6 months. The taxonomy is only about investments into new infrastructure or energy production capacity. So it's something that gives a long-term signal to the market for investors to put money into one particular source of energy or another. And so it's not something that is going to affect the price situation in the short term. In the long term, of course, yes, this is something that could have an influence because the taxonomy will decrease the cost of capital for energy companies. And so this could have a positive influence on retail prices for consumers over the long run. But this is by no means guaranteed because energy companies can, of course, decide to pocket the difference and keep those profits for themselves. There is absolutely no guarantee that the consumers will end up benefiting from that.
Okay, my last question for you is a geopolitical one. The EU imports a lot of gas. Do you think that finding new agreements with the supplier countries, especially Russia, of course, could lead to some immediate solution?
Well, obviously, yes, Russia has been at the center of concern in this energy crisis. And actually, Moscow has said that the situation could be improved greatly if a new pipeline delivering gas to Germany, pipeline called Nord Stream 2, is allowed to open soon. So you may be aware this pipeline has already been built. It's currently waiting approval from the regulatory authorities in Germany and also in the European Union. And Moscow has said, you know, give approval to this pipeline and we can start delivering new gas. The problem is that Russia could be doing this already now. It has been withholding its deliveries of gas to the European Union through the existing pipelines for some time now. And it seems it's likely to be using this crisis to pressure Germany and the EU to deliver the final authorization for Nord Stream 2. So even if the authorization was delivered tomorrow, there is no guarantee that Russia wouldn't put pressure again on Europe, maybe not next week, but in the future, maybe next year, for example, if there is a major diplomatic fallout on any international issue, for example, the situation in Ukraine. And this is what the detractors of Nord Stream 2 have been warning about, that the pipeline Nord Stream 2 gives Russia even more leverage to exert pressure on the European Union and use gas as a lever for its foreign policy. So if anything, the EU can only hope to receive more deliveries from other suppliers for the time being, other suppliers like Norway or potentially Algeria. In fact, Norway has already started delivering more gas to the EU, but the quantities so far are not yet enough to make a huge difference on the market. And so what we're seeing now is that the European countries are starting more and more to make use of their existing reserves. Countries like the Netherlands, for example, still have reserves of gas in the North Sea, and could be tapping a bit more into that in order to ease the situation. But these resources are not infinite, and so effectively the European Union is more and more dependent on imports and external suppliers. So with Russia becoming less and less dependable as a supplier, we're increasingly now reliant on other countries like Norway, which fortunately have plenty of gas reserves and could start delivering more. But the current situation on the market is so tight at the moment that even a country like Norway is not in a situation to dramatically increase its production and deliveries to the European Union in the short term.
Many thanks, Frédéric. We will see how this important and as well interesting issue will develop in the next future. And of course, keep following us on EURACTIV for the latest updates. Let's move on now to the second topic of this podcast, which is the Conference on the Future of Europe, started last May, is bringing citizens to discuss about the future of the EU and its institutions. I have here with me Eleonora Vasques, who is following for EURACTIV the conference. So, Eleonora, thanks a lot for being here. Hello there. How is the conference going and what have been the highlights so far?
Well, I think it's going well. Now the panels are meeting online. There are 4 panels with 800 citizens that are elaborating recommendations for MEPs, but also for the Council and the Commission, because the whole conference will be evaluated by the Parliament, Council and the Commission at the end of the process. In December and in January, all the citizens of the panels will meet online to draft the recommendations, because for the panels is a 3-stage process. The first one was to highlight the interest of the 4 thematic panels. The second stage was to elaborate tendencies and orientations of the thematics, and then the third stage will be dedicated to the recommendation themselves. I think that it is nice to see people discussing, elder person from Cyprus discuss from a young teenager from Italy or something else. It's a very interesting and constructive moment of democracy, I think.
All right, but despite the low interest for the conference in the media, the number of the visits to the online platform and the endorsement are encouraging. But could the institutions and the media have done more?
I want to do a premise for this. I think, the participation in the online multilingual platform is encouraging in a context where nobody are really speaking about the conference. But there is one reason for this. For journalists, it's easier to talk about a polarized debate rather than to talk about polite people discussing about how to reform the EU, because it is easier to explain and to give voice to a yes or no position towards something, for example, Brexit or migration or same-sex marriages, for example. It is not easy to give a direction or to do a breaking news about a deliberative democracy process. For this reason, I think the number are low if we compare with the number of European residents and citizens, but are encouraging in a context that nobody are really talking about the conference on the media. What I suggest to journalists to be to pay attention to the next proposals that will come very soon in December and in January, so they can discuss about at least some recommendations, for instance.
Okay, but for what we've seen so far, what would the future of the conference look like? Do you think it could turn into a permanent exercise of discussions among citizens and institutions, or will it be a one-time exercise? Will it actually lead to some change in the future?
That's a very interesting question. I believe that it is not predictable how the conference will be finished, because we have to see how will be the follow-up. How the recommendation will be considered, and if some recommendation will become laws, basically. Because on this depends also the whole experiment. I believe we need more and more deliberative democracy processes like this, also because we can implement and learn from mistakes to do a better, I think, edition also of the conference in the future, because it's a very innovative way to discuss democracy. I believe we are in a very hard time where there are a lot of forces that are against the concept of diversity, against the concept of inclusion, and so on. We can see, for example, the situation with Belarus. We can see it with the situation as well with the Visegrad states in Europe. So I believe that if we can find a way to get people involved in a polite and nice discussion, that they feel heard from institutions and they can really be part of a policy-making process, I think it is something they can do. For instance, there are some experiments like this, for example, in the region of Brussels, and they are they are working and building on a committee dedicated to deliberative democracy processes, for example. And I think the EU can do the same, because the EU has the tools and the resources to do that.
And I guess that's all for today. Thanks a lot, Eleonora. I am Mirko Paradiso, and this was EURACTIV's Beyond the Byline podcast. We'll be back on your feed next week with our Evie Corey at the microphone. But until then, you can subscribe to our podcast newsletter and visit EURACTIV.com for the latest news. And don't forget to listen to this podcast on your favorite podcast app. Thank you very much for listening. Have a good rest of the week. Bye.